is a debate on motion 22213 in the name of Bill Kidd on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee on Complaints Against MSPs, amendment of the Scottish Parliamentary Standards Commissioner Act 2002. May I ask those who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, please, and I call on Bill Kidd to speak to and move the motion for up to 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The committee's proposal to introduce a committee bill in relation to sexual harassment complaints marks the culmination of work initiated by the Parliament in 2017 to address sexual harassment. Over the course of that time, a series of changes have been made to the Code of Conduct with the aim of ensuring that MSPs, MSP staff and parliamentary staff who experience sexual harassment can be assured that their complaint will be investigated independently and in confidence. The Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee initiated an inquiry into sexual harassment and inappropriate conduct in 2017, which examined the Parliament's processes and procedures for dealing with sexual misconduct by MSPs. While this was underway, the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body launched a sexual harassment helpline and issued a survey to all staff and members in order to establish baseline information on staff and MSP experiences and their attitude to reporting sexual harassment. A joint working group established by the Parliament in February 2018 to progress the work arising from the results of the staff survey also considered the committee's inquiry report. The joint working group was made up of representatives from all parties, as well as senior members of parliamentary staff and a representative from Engender. The joint working group reported in December 2018 and made a series of recommendations. Following a consultation on its recommendations, its report was referred by the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body to our committee to implement the recommendations relating to the standards regime in the Parliament. The committee considered the Joint Working Group's recommendations in the report in the first half of 2019 before consulting MSPs on proposed revisions to the Code of Conduct to implement 2 of the Working Group's key recommendations. These were that no time limit should be applied to complaints of sexual harassment and members should be held to account for their behaviour towards their own staff in the same way as their behaviour towards anyone else. The Joint Working Group also wished to see consistency of approach to all investigations of allegations of sexual harassment by MSPs. Following its consultation, the committee recommended a number of changes to the Code of Conduct which were agreed by the Parliament at the end of last year, coming into effect in January. These made it possible for the Commissioner for Public's Ethical Standards in Public Life to investigate complaints about an MSP's treatment of a member of the Parliament staff or an MSP's treatment of a member of staff of another member. Such complaints had previously been excluded complaints and subject to different procedures. Only if those procedures failed to reach a resolution could they then be referred to the Commissioner. The Code changes also introduced a standard of conduct for MSPs towards their own staff for the first time. The new standard, agreed by the Parliament, prohibits MSPs from behaving in a manner towards their own staff that includes bullying, harassment, including sexual harassment, or any other inappropriate behaviour. Although clearly never acceptable, sexual misconduct by an MSP towards his or her own staff was explicitly prohibited by the Code of Conduct from that moment forward. However, legislative change would be required to address historic conduct by MSPs towards their own staff members, as recommended by the Joint Working Group. This is because the Act governing the remit of the Standards Commissioner only allows her to investigate breaches of a relevant provision, which includes the Code of Conduct, standing orders, or of legislation relating to members' interests in place at the time of the alleged misconduct. The Joint Working Group also specifically recommended the removal of any extra barriers to the bringing forward of complaints which are made more than a year after the complainer becomes aware of the misconduct. The committee believes that this should be applied to complaints of any breaches, not just those relating to sexual harassment. The committee now presents the Parliament with a proposal for a committee bill under Rule 9.15 of Standing Orders, which aims to address both of these issues. In drawing up plans to introduce this bill, the committee invited political parties, MSPs, MSP staff and those who responded to the committee's 2018 inquiry and anyone else with an interest to respond to its proposals. The responses are published on the committee's web page, and the Scottish Women's Convention pointed out the psychological toll that historic sexual harassment has on victims, while Engender's submission referred to the power dynamic between MSPs and their staff. Both submissions welcomed the proposed creation of an alternative independent route for complaints that did not involve complaining directly to the employing MSP. To summarise the committee's proposal, the bill would adjust what is treated as a relevant provision for the purposes of the Commissioner's investigations under the 2002 Act, so that complaints about historic instances of sexual harassment by MSPs towards their own staff can be dealt with in the same way as conduct towards other staff or MSPs. Yes, I certainly will. Yeah.
Mike Rumbles.
Just for a point of clarity, really, would this apply to, this historic approach apply to not just current MSPs but previous ones, or not?
Bill Kidd.
Thank you. Well, I'll just come on to that in a short second. I hope, actually, I think this will explain it. So, under the 2002 Act, the complaints about historic instances of sexual harassment by MSPs towards their own staff can be dealt with in the same way as conduct towards other staff or MSPs. It's important at this stage that I point out that this change will apply only to complaints of sexual harassment. It will not be possible to reopen minor historical grievances or the breakdown of working relationship as a result of these changes. The bill would also remove a requirement in the 2002 Act that requires a complaint to be made within 1 year from the date when the complainer could reasonably have become aware of the conduct complained about. That is a point, actually, Presiding Officer, which I think might be relevant to what has been raised by Mike Rumbles there, actually, in terms of the period of time when the complaint has to be made. And this removes the requirement in the Act which requires a complaint to be made within 1 year of the date when the complainant could have reasonably become aware of the conduct complained about. On that basis, it takes the timescale further back, actually, which I think, and I'll have to take further advice on that, but I think that covers the area that you were asking about. It might not, Mr Rumbles, but if it doesn't, I'll certainly check that for you. No problem at all. For simplicity, this will apply to all older complaints, not just those involving sexual harassment. While it has always been possible for the Commissioner to investigate older complaints following a direction of the committee, this removes a hurdle that might inhibit complainers from coming forward. Finally, the proposed bill would also contain a housekeeping amendment to the 2002 Act, removing the requirement for signatures when lodging or withdrawing complaints with the Commissioner to better reflect modern working practices. I commend the committee's proposal to the Parliament and move the motion in my name. Thank you. I'll come back to you, Mike. Okay.
Thank you, Mr Kidd. And I now call on Graham Day for up to 6 minutes, please, Minister.
Presiding Officer, I propose to keep my contribution to this debate relatively short, as others may, I suspect, because I doubt if there's much, if anything, that will divide us on this matter. The Government's views on sexual harassment are well known, and the proposals set out in this committee report are very much a matter for the Parliament. But aside from the process element of this debate, it also affords us a further opportunity to place on record a statement which I am confident is shared by all of us in the Chamber today, that sexual harassment or abuse of any form, whether in the workplace, in the home or in society, is reprehensible and cannot be tolerated. The Government was fully supportive of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee inquiry into sexual harassment and inappropriate behaviour in the Scottish Parliament, because everyone has the right to work and live their life free of abuse, harassment and intimidation, and it's imperative that the Scottish Parliament exemplifies these principles. Parliamentary rules and practices should be fair, sensitive and supportive of everyone. No individual should be discouraged from working in or engaging with this Parliament. This committee bill proposal, as it's set out in the report, is, as we've heard from the convener, shaped by the committee's inquiry into sexual harassment and the recommendations of the Parliament's joint working group. Indeed, the bill's proposal follows on from a suite of reforms already implemented by the Parliament to tackle harassment and now enshrined in the MSP Code of Conduct, parliamentary policy frameworks and the Parliament's internal processes for handling any allegations that may arise. The focus on encouraging individuals to raise their concerns with an assurance that such issues will be handled sensitively and discreetly is especially welcome. The aim of the bill proposal is to complete the implementation of working group recommendations, specifically those that could only be delivered through primary legislation. The Government notes that changes are proposed to the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner Act 2002 to allow for investigation of complaints about a historical nature, to remove extra requirements for the investigation of older complaints in general, and the Committee's own proposal for removing the requirement for complaints and complaint withdrawals to be signed. The Government is supportive in principle of the bill as proposed, subject to the sight of the bill that would be brought forward for introduction. But I will take this opportunity to formally confirm that should Parliament agree to the bill proposal, the Government would not wish to exercise its right to legislate in that regard. Presiding Officer, in closing, I also want to further air a related issue which I have raised with the committee and one which I understand would be a matter for the MSP Code of Conduct as opposed to the proposed bill. But I would welcome some further confirmation of that. The issue in question is whether Scottish Government officials could be reassured that any reforms to the MSP conduct framework and any associated complaint handling procedures would apply to them as well as MSP staff and staff in the Parliamentary Service. As I said, the Government would welcome any reassurance the committee could offer on that specific point. Presiding Officer, as I've noted, the Government welcomes and is supportive of the committee's report, and I look forward to hearing the views of other members. Presiding Officer.
I now call on Jamie Halcrow-Johnson for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Everyone who works in this Parliament has an interest in ensuring that the public can have confidence that we operate with a high level of integrity and propriety. This has been part of the Parliament's ethos since it was created in 1999. Integrity is one of the 4 principles inscribed on the mace that is sat before presiding officers during every session, symbolising this chamber's authority. There have, of course, been challenges to this Parliament's reputation over the past 2 decades, including a number in recent times. Where people's faith in their public institutions has been dented, it is often more than simply the actions of individuals that have fallen short of the standards we set ourselves. In these cases, the actions and precautions taken by our institutions have often fallen short too. It's by acknowledging that those institutional shortcomings that we can begin to make real change, not just in terms of the processes we have in place, but in our organisational culture as well. We have institutionally failed for many years to root out and tackle many of the problems that have given rise to the discussions we're having today. Unlike most workplaces, individual incidents here are likely to receive extensive coverage in the media. Our behaviour is very much under scrutiny and sends a signal to wider society. One thing is clear, nobody benefits in these situations. When our reputation is dented, it diminishes not just individuals or specific political parties, it diminishes us all. And sadly, this is true not just for elected members amongst us, but also those who are attached to the Parliament, who work in it and with it. We are all aware of specific concerns that have prompted the proposed changes. Over recent years, there's been a significant effort to tackle sexual harassment and inappropriate behaviour. Conduct that, as a first step, we must acknowledge has previously been overlooked, ignored or excused. We've heard the testimony of many people who have been affected. There are undoubtedly more who have yet to be heard and maybe never will. The Parliament has acted on these issues, and I commend the work of the corporate body, as well as many of the parliamentary staff who were involved across a number of departments. The Joint Working Group reported its recommendations, and it is down to these recommendations that we have made the progress we have so far. It is important that consensus could be built around a shared set of proposals for change. We're in the unusual position around this chamber of being 129 small employers, but all quite equally invested in the Scottish Parliament, both as an organisation and as a community. I believe it's important that members continue to have the ability to manage their own staff and have flexibility within reason to best serve their constituents in the ways they see fit. But it's vital, too, that the right processes are in place to effectively tackle situations where there are serious problems. As we've heard outlined, the recommendations of the Joint Working Group have already brought about positive change. These have clarified the expected standards of conduct between MSPs and staff and further recognised that bullying, harassment and inappropriate behaviour is entirely incompatible with the elected position at the heart of public life. We have yet to tackle these proposed changes to their conclusion. The committee has agreed with the recommendations of the Joint Working Group and made clear our position that it's in the interest of this Parliament, as well as the wider public, to allow for effective investigation of historic allegations of improper conduct that have taken place within this institution. The legislation proposed will not be complex. It will ensure that it is within the power of the Ethical Standards Commissioner to take forward complaints of this type of sexual harassment that have occurred in the past, removing the current one-year limitation that exists in statute. Presiding Officer, the work that this Parliament and the political parties represented here have done to tackle improper conduct over the past 2 years has been a step in the right direction. We've long accepted that this sort of behaviour is wrong and that people who we employ should never have to accept it in any form as part of coming into work. The committee is proposing that we start to deliver on the remaining outstanding issues, ensuring that we have the processes in place that can address the problems we have faced. I join with my fellow committee members in recommending that the proposed legislation be brought before this chamber.
Neil Findlay, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. The bill follows on from concerns raised about sexual harassment and such behaviour in this Parliament. And the subsequent survey that was circulated to gauge the experience of people who work here, it was a sobering piece of work. This committee bill is a response to the work of the Joint Working Group on Sexual Harassment and Sexual Behaviour, and the recommendation of the group is that there should be no time limit applied to the to complaints of sexual harassment. So the bill would allow complaints to be made in relation to historic misconduct on the part of any serving or former MSP, I'm led to believe. So therefore that should answer Mr Rumble's question, and that's conduct towards his or her staff. Again, my understanding is this is already the case for complaints about the conduct of SCPB staff and other MSPs. The Parliament started looking into this at the end of 2017 when the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee agreed to carry out an inquiry into the procedures for dealing with sexual harassment and misconduct, and this bill follows up on that work, removing the admissibility requirement that a complaint be made within 1 year and allowing the Commissioner to investigate complaints made by any member's own staff in relation to sexual harassment as alleged to have taken place in the past. It will deal with complaints about historic sexual harassment by MSPs towards their own staff and remove the requirement for a signature on any complaints. And that's part of a wider range of measures that have been taken to tackle sexual harassment and inappropriate behaviour in the Parliament. We've already heard about the sexual harassment helpline which was set up and the subsequent survey of all staff and members that came out of that. And that survey found that a majority of people, 78%, had never experienced any sexual harassment or sexist behaviour. However, 20%, that's a fifth of people who work here, had experienced this behaviour whilst working in our national Parliament. 30% of women and 6% of men reported experiencing this type of behaviour. That should shock all of us that is the response of those who took part. So key changes to the Code of Conduct were agreed in 2019 and came into practice in 2020. Historically, conduct and matters between MSP and their own staff was addressed out with the Code of Conduct and via employment law, but that has changed since January 2020. And the Code of Conduct was amended to ensure MSPs treat their own staff with courtesy and respect. It's absolutely astonishing that we had to do that. I would have expected all MSPs to treat their own staff with courtesy and respect, and I hope we all do. Any complaint about behaviour prior to January 2020 is currently inadmissible. Therefore, the legislative change that has been put forward is required to ensure there is no time limit. The proposed change removes that 1 year provision and the requirement that complaints need to be signed. And the online process will provide some safeguards to ensure that the identity of a complainant is fully established and that only the complainant is able to withdraw the complaint. This is a fairly straightforward committee bill. These are practical and necessary follow-up steps, and I hope they will receive our unanimous support today. Thanks, Presiding Officer.
Gosh, everyone is really paying attention to brevity today. I'm quite stunned. We now move on to the open debate. There seems to be a bit of confusion with some people having pressed buttons and some not. So could I ask everyone to check that they've got it right? We'll move to the open debate. Speeches of 4 minutes, please. Gil Patterson, followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The proposed bill, Complaints Against MSPs, amendment of the Scottish Parliamentary Standards Commissioner Act 2002, is an important part of ensuring that the Parliament upholds the highest standards in dealing with complaints against the behaviour of MSPs. The Joint Working Group on Sexual Harassment and Sexist Behaviour identified amongst their recommendations one issue which would require primary legislation, and that was in relation to their recommendation that there should be no time applied to complaints on sexual harassment, a principle I am very happy to support and endorse. As we have seen over the years, it can take many years for those who have been sexually harassed or abused to gain the confidence to make a complaint against their boss, who can have control over their careers and professional future. So it is absolutely unnecessary, in my view, to withdraw the 1 year cut-off to make a complaint against an MSP contained in the 2002 Act. After consideration by all parties, the other recommendation by the joint working groups were incorporated into the Code of Conduct for MSPs, and they have been effective since January 2020. As part of the whole consultation process, another important statement surfaced, which said that MSPs should be held to account for their behaviour towards their own staff in the same way as their behaviour towards anyone else, which is very obvious when you hear it expressed as simply as that. Why was it not the case in the first place? I was particularly pleased that as part of the amendment process, the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee have expanded the Joint Working Group's recommendation to remove the 1 year provision to cover all complaints about MSP's behaviour towards their staff. This will result in a single set of rules which will be much easier to administer staff complaints against MSPs, MSP's unacceptable behaviour. Harassment and bullying, unfortunately, has become such a big part of many people's working lives, or maybe it's just seen it's that way because of the media attention and high-profile, powerful people being called to account for their actions. On balance, though, I suspect that bullying and harassment is a working environment has always been there, but with a new awareness and a collective public condemnation of these unfair and counterproductive practices, together with those affected by bullying and harassment having the courage to go public and challenge inappropriate behaviour, is slowly putting an end to a very unfair era, and I certainly hope so that that's the case. All in all, I think the proposed amendment will enhance the equity of our staff complaints procedures and urge everyone to support the proposals at decision time. Thank you.
Rachel Hamilton, followed by Claire Adams.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Scottish Parliament should be a safe and pleasant environment where staff feel comfortable in their place of work, but also confident to report harassment of any kind. Setting standards in this place should set an example across all levels of government, public and private sector and wider society. Over the years, this hasn't been the case, and many members of staff have been let down. The recent Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body survey found that a fifth of respondents had experienced such behaviour whilst working in the Parliament. Predictably, when analysing the results, they showed that 30% of women and 6% of men reported experiencing this behaviour in some form. These statistics are concerning and require continual improvement. However, actions have been taken in this Parliament with various policies, such as the Culture of Respect workshops, which I attended, and saw a high level of participation from both staff and MSPs. The Standard Procedures and Public Appointments Committee announced a proposal for a committee bill to amend the Scottish Parliamentary Standards Commissioner Act 2002, stemming from the committee's work and in writing to Dame Laura Cox, author of the Independence Inquiry report Bullying and Harassment of House of Commons staff, to share their views. At this point, I want to thank Engender for submitting evidence to the consultation, and I echo the calls from the Scottish Women's Convention to analyse the power imbalance in the workplace, calling for a commitment to tackling the deficiency of equal representation at parliamentary level. Presiding Officer, we mustn't forget the psychological toll that historic sexual harassment has on victims on an ongoing basis. I agree with SWC that the current time limit of 1 year creates an unfriendly, unsupportive and toxic atmosphere within the work environment. It's natural that some individuals may require a little more time to consider making a complaint. Removing that time limit could even act as a catalyst to encourage others to come forward. And in light of this, the committee agreed that there should be no time limit applied to complaints of sexual harassment. The legislative change would be necessary to allow for historic complaints about sexual harassment by MSPs of their own staff to be investigated under the 2002 Act. The proposed committee bill deals with a change to the admissibility criteria in that Act in relation to older complaints in general and responds to the recommendations of the Joint Working Group on Sexual Harassment and Sexual Behaviour. Because for many former employees, sexual harassment is a key factor in an employee moving jobs. And therefore, the victim may only become empowered to speak out after years after their employment has ended in the Parliament. Removing the requirement for a signature on complaints and on complaints withdrawals is also an important amendment, which allows staff to anonymously report incidents of harassment. Yet there is still a long way to go in helping survivors of harassment, not just in this place, but in other workplaces across Scotland. This is not a party political issue, nor does it affect any one party more than another. It crisscrosses across society in general, and getting it wrong causes reputational damage. Above all, we have a duty to get it right. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, we must promote the highest standards of conduct amongst those elected in this Parliament. In doing so, we uphold public confidence in the good reputation of this Scottish Parliament. On these benches, we support the committee bill and its principles. We must strive to make our staff feel safe and secure in their employment in this Parliament. Thank you.
That was, in fact, the last of the contributions in the open debate, so we move now to the closing speeches. Just for information for people, I think the stage 3 may well start about 10 to 4. So can I call Rhoda Grant, please, for 4 minutes?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The role we hold as MSPs is a privilege, and we should aspire to a high standard of behaviour, but sadly, this is not always the case. Neil Findlay pointed out the shocking statistics from the staff survey, but what was even more shocking, that 45% of the perpetrators in that survey was an MSP. I was a member of the joint working group that was set up to deal with that desperate situation, and the legislation comes from the recommendations of that working group. It's very clear that sexual harassment is based in an imbalance of power relations. The privilege of being an MSP bestows power on us all, and abuse of that power is simply wrong. It's an abuse of the privilege that we have, a privilege that was given to us by the Scottish people. And therefore, I welcome consensus from the whole Parliament that this legislation is necessary. One of the most difficult issues that the Joint Working Group looked at was the protection of MSP staff. They're directly employed by MSPs. They have no right of appeal beyond them, either to the Parliament, to the Scottish Government, or indeed to their party. And therefore, extending the remit of the Commissioner for Ethical Standards in Public Life to investigate complaints adds to the protection for staff. And it could also be a deterrent to MSPs who would seek to abuse people in that vulnerable position. Graham Day and Neil Findlay talked about extending this protection to Scottish Government staff and to Parliament staff. And I agree with that, but at the same time, Scottish Government staff and Parliament staff have a right to complain to their line management and a right to have those complaints investigated beyond that MSP as the situation stands. An employer would normally investigate, and maybe that is the right way to do it with those members of staff, because they could also put in the supports required for those members of staff while that investigation continues. However, if an MSP were found guilty of harassing Parliament or Scottish Government staff, then it would be right and proper that the Commissioner for Ethical Standards in Public Life would look at that and look at sanctions for that MSP. I also welcome removing the one-year cut-off for complaints with regard to sexual harassment, because it shows an understanding of that in the victim. There's a reluctance to come forward because it impacts on someone's self-esteem, there's an embarrassment attached, and there's also for MSP staff a huge fear about their employment. Add to that that our staff normally share our political affiliation, and there's a reluctance to call out an MSP if that could cause reputational damage to the party because of that affiliation. I say to anybody who is a victim of such abuse, that is not them that is causing that damage. It is the person that is perpetrating that abuse. I ask them never to be silenced by someone who preys on their party loyalty while they do not display the same loyalty themselves. We need to have zero tolerance to sexual harassment, and this change works towards that. All our staff need to feel safe in their workplace. We are in a privileged position. It's unacceptable for anyone who would seek to abuse that privilege and that position, and therefore it's right the protections are put in place to hold abusers to account.
Alexander Stewart, please, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Delighted to have the opportunity to be involved in this important debate today. Sexual harassment and inappropriate conduct in all forms is completely unacceptable, and we should all stand resolutely to ensure that that conduct is the case, not just in the Scottish Parliament, but in workplaces throughout Scotland and everywhere else. And we've heard that MSPs were involved in a survey, and we found that 1 in 5 respondents who came back from that survey put out by the corporate body indicated that the sexual harassment or sexual behaviour or sexist behaviour had been part and parcel. Now, Deputy President, that's a very high statistic, and Neil Findlay talked about that. 20% of individuals filled in the survey to indicate there was a problem, and that has to be tackled. There are some steps that have been taken that are very welcome. The Joint Working Group on Sexual Harassment and the instruction to ensure that the Code of Conduct was enhanced and supported, I think is only right. And the right that the Commissioner should have complaints against MSPs and their staff, so it shouldn't be just left down to the law. We should have an opportunity within this place to deal with that and ensure that we send out a very strong message. In the view of many of the individuals, the complaints about sexual harassment, it's important that that code of conduct was introduced and has been revised, and it is very much explicit within that. And it's also right that complainants cannot currently come forward after 1 year. Now, that in itself was a real anomaly, and that has to be challenged, and that had to be taken forward, and it has been. And especially in cases where, sexual harassment, many people find it very difficult to even deal with that and lock it away in some shape, way or form. And it may take years for them to come out and be able to challenge that and to engage and want to do that. And it may be because of other people and other individuals who've made that help them and support them through that. So we need to have the confidence in the whole process. And I think this bill will give that and ensure. I mean, Bill Kidd talked about the joint working group and talked about the time limit and ensured that members should be held to account for their actions. And I think that's vitally important that they are. Jamie Halcott-Johnson talked about the reputation of this organisation and institutions, not just the Scottish Parliament, but everywhere else. They have to be involved in that, and actions need to be taken to ensure that that does become the case. And Rachel Hamilton talked about a safe place to work. People should have the confidence of coming into an environment and working for individuals who may be perceived as powerful and having a direction, but they also have rights and responsibilities to ensure that they take care and look after individuals who are working in this place. So in conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, we in the Scottish Conservatives are fully supportive of this bill and would seek to see it and what it seems to achieve. The types of sexual harassment and misconduct cannot be allowed to be tolerated in any shape, way or form. And people should have the opportunity to ensure that every time that people in power can be challenged and should be challenged, because that's vitally important that staff have the confidence in ensuring that everything should take place in their workplace. The bill is an important step in the right direction, but we cannot and we must not be complacent about it. We must continue to do all we can to secure that and give the image and the presence, Deputy Presiding Officer, that we are taking this very seriously in this place. Because it's from this place that we should be seen, and our reputation as parliamentarians is vitally important. So I very much support many of the aspects of the bill, and so does my party. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Graham Day, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Presiding Officer, I'll take a lot less than that. As I said at the outset, I kept my contribution at the start very short, because I don't think there is anything at all that divides us on this issue whatsoever. And I think the contributions we've heard from members have just confirmed that. I was particularly struck by Rachel Hamilton's comments about this being not a party political issue. And she went on to talk about the way in which it crosses society and impacts workplaces the length and breadth of Scotland. Sadly, that is correct, but we have a responsibility as the Scottish Parliament to take a lead in this, and I think this bill proposal does that. So I very much welcome the bill proposal, the tone of the debate, and look forward to seeing this bill proposal come to fruition. Presiding Officer.
I now call on Bill Kidd to wind up the debate on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. You can have as long as you like, Mr Kidd.
I'll just be popular then and not take too long. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I just cover two short issues just before I get into the meat of this closure? And that is one, Mike Rumbles. Yes, indeed, I should have just been able to say it right off the top of my head, but for some reason it just leapt out. But as covered by my committee colleague, Neil Finlay, yes, this does cover previous and former MSPs, so that's put to bed. Minister, also at one point you asked whether Scottish Government officials should be covered in the work. The work is due to be considered by the SPPA, which includes Scottish Government officials. This doesn't require legislation but changes to the code, so we will be able to do that also. Thank you very much for that. So in closing this debate for the committee, I would like to reiterate the fact that this bill is not an isolated piece of work, but instead the last piece in the jigsaw to deliver the recommendations made by the Joint Working Group on Sexual Harassment. The joint working group consisted of representatives from all of the political parties, and I am pleased to see the same cross-party support echoed in this afternoon's debate. It goes without saying that everyone in this chamber supports the highest standards for MSPs, and this legislation signals that we take the issue of sexual harassment seriously and that there's no place for it in the Parliament. As I said earlier, the proposed bill would open up a complaints route for historical conduct, which was previously unavailable to one group of staff, that is, those harassed by their employing MSP. When legislation makes changes about historic cases, questions of fairness naturally arise. However, the committee felt confident in bringing this proposed bill forward because, of course, it has never been acceptable or indeed lawful for an MSP to sexually harass his or her own staff. It's just that cases of this nature were previously dealt with through employment grievance procedures. We don't think it's fair to single out one group for different treatment and agree with the joint working group that the Parliament should be able to hold members to account for their behaviour towards their own staff in the same way as their behaviour towards anyone else. I hardly need to remind members that the Parliament has a zero-tolerance approach to sexual harassment. Such conduct brings the Parliament into disrepute, and as such, there is now a compelling public interest in bringing these past cases within the Commissioner's remit. It's not helpful for there to be a range of different options for bringing complaints depending on your job role, who harassed you and when they harassed you. That type of clutter and confusion only inhibits people from coming forward. Turning to the proposed provision on the one-year admissibility step for all MSP complaints, the Commissioner is currently obliged to seek a direction from the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee to investigate any complaints made within 1 year of the complainer being aware of the conduct. Thus, it has always been possible for complaints of an historic nature to be made. The only change is that the Commissioner will no longer be required to seek a direction from the committee before investigating them. This will further ensure the independence of the complaints process. I remind members that the Parliament's Joint Working Group on Sexual Harassment recommended that this hurdle be removed. It said there should be no time limit applied to complaints of sexual harassment. Each complaint should be dealt with on its own merits and how far back the allegations go. It added that if our aim is to create a culture where people feel more confident to report, we believe it would be counterproductive to set a time limit on making such complaints. This bill is a result of a long and carefully considered piece of work by the committee, and it gives me pleasure to close the debate on behalf of the committee and invite you to support the motion seeking the Parliament's agreement that the bill can be introduced. Thank you very much.
That concludes the debate on complaints against MSPs, amendment of the Scottish Parliamentary Standards Commissioner Act 2002. And it's now time to move on to the next item of business.